Welcome to OPC Radio Connect, the podcast that connects you with the services and programs of the Office of the People's Counsel, the independent D.C. government agency that represents the interests of electric, natural gas, water, and local phone consumers, whose mission it is to advocate, educate, and protect district utility consumers. Now, here's your host, Sandra Matavu-Fry, Director of the Office of the People's Counsel for the District of Columbia.
Hello, and welcome to OPC Radio Connect on DC Radio. I am Lawrence Daniels, Director of Litigation at the Office of People's Counsel. Today, I'm sitting in for the regular host, Sandra Matavu-Fry. OPC's podcast is designed to help DC utility consumers get the most value from your dollar by learning about the issues affecting your electric, natural gas, telephone, and water utility service. OPC is your statutory legal advocate on behalf of all utility ratepayers. Our mission is to advocate, educate, and protect consumers in all 8 wards of the District of Columbia. On OPC Radio Connect, we will bring you information about a variety of topics related to utilities, energy efficiency tips, the environment and climate change, and how all that figures into your daily living. You will hear from OPC staff, experts, and other advocates. Today, we're talking about large utility infrastructure projects, specifically projects being constructed by Pepco and Washington Gas Light. Here today to discuss these projects are 3 attorneys with the Office of People's Counsel. We have with us today Attorney Barbara Burton.
Hi, Lawrence. Thank you.
Thank you. Attorney Thaddeus Johnson.
Thanks for having me.
All right. And Attorney Travis Smith.
Good morning.
In today's podcast, we'll be discussing ongoing projects in the utility infrastructure in the District of Columbia and the cost involved for those projects. Now, for the benefit of our listeners, I want to provide a bit of context for what defines the utility infrastructure. The utility infrastructure is actually very large and comprised of 3 different components. The first is generation, and that's the source where electricity and gas is actually made. That happens outside of the boundaries of the District of Columbia. The second is transmission, and that's the path from the generation source to DC. That's how the electricity and the gas is actually transported to the district, and that is also outside of the District of Columbia. Those 2 functions are regulated by the federal government. DC Public Service Commission, the local regulator, has no regulatory authority over those 2 functions. The third component of the infrastructure is the distribution network. That is inside the boundaries of the District of Columbia. Those are the poles, the wires, the conduit that carries the electricity and the natural gas to consumers. Our focus today, and for purposes of our discussion, will be on the distribution network. The PSC and DC, again, have no jurisdiction on those other 2 functions. One interesting note, 65% of your bill is determined by the federal government's regulation of the generation and transmission functions that I described earlier. The cost to operate the distribution network is regulated by the DC Public Service Commission, and those rates are determined in proceedings that we call rate cases. And in those cases, what we do is we examine very carefully the capital expenditures that you're going to be hearing about, some of the big numbers you're going to be hearing about for these big infrastructure projects. Also, the operating costs for the daily maintenance, the cost for the poles, the wires, the trucks, the personnel to do the day-to-day operation to provide you the service, and also the profit level that utilities have an opportunity to earn. In those rate cases, that's how your rates are determined. Now, turning to today's topic, large infrastructure projects. The central issue for many utilities across the country, including Pepco and Washington Gas, is that many of these infrastructures, in particular the distribution networks, were built over 100 years ago, and they are due to be upgraded because of age and decay, or the need to modernize to address climate change, or to harden the system to resist severe weather or cyber attacks, which are on the rise. Before we get into each one of your projects, I have a general question for each one of you. I mentioned a couple of reasons why these projects are ongoing. I want to start with you first, Barbara. What was the driving force behind the need for Pepco's Capital Grid project?
Well, Pepco will tell you that a driving force for its Capital Grid project was replacing, improving aging infrastructure. And as you mentioned, some of this infrastructure has been underground for 100 years or more, and it just needs to be replaced. It has worn out. Another driving force for Pepco in proposing its Capital Grid project was to address providing electricity to future loads.
Okay.
And that's why the company has proposed to build a new substation in Mount Vernon.
Okay, thank you very much. Thaddeus, for Washington Gas, what was the driving force behind Project Pipes?
Well, as you mentioned, the condition of natural gas infrastructure across the nation, well, it's a nationwide issue. You may know that the United States has the largest generation, transmission, and distribution natural gas system in the world. And in many portions, this natural gas delivery system is outdated and at capacity.
Yeah.
Specifically about the District of Columbia, the present system contains about 500 miles of pipe, and it's all of different vintage and material. Yeah. So given the age of these systems, it's a possibility that a utility might not always know exactly what it has underground and how old it is. So it's an important issue because safety cannot be underestimated. And while natural gas accidents are rare, when they do happen, they can be catastrophic. So we want to stay on top of that.
Okay. All right. Finally, Travis, what was the driving force behind Pepco's DC Plug project?
Well, Lawrence, in 2012, former Mayor Vincent Gray formed an underground task force in response to a number of calamitous weather events that had occurred in the district from about 2010 through 2012, a number of which I'm sure a number of our listeners can probably remember, such as the 2010 Snowmageddon, 2012 Derecho, Superstorm Sandy, things of that like. And so in forming the task force, he charged them with looking into the question of the feasibility of undergrounding Pepco's poorest performing feeders. Again, the idea was trying to see if that would make the system more what's known as resilient. And by resiliency, what we're referring to is the system's ability to withstand extreme weather events as opposed to reliability. Reliability, that speaks to how the system performs under normal conditions. So in other words, the idea behind DC Plug is to storm harden the system to make it more impervious to extreme weather events.
Okay, thank you for those responses. Barbara, let's start with you. Talking about Pepco's Capital Grid project. What is the Capital Grid project and why is it important?
Well, the Capital Grid project involves the renovation of a couple of existing substations in the district, the construction of a new substation, and the construction of an underground transmission line to make it easier for Pepco to deliver electricity to its customers. Specifically, Pepco proposes to upgrade two existing substations in Northwest DC, the Harvard Street substation and the Champaign substation. Pepco proposes to build a brand new substation in the Nomah, Mount Vernon area. And finally, Pepco proposes to build an approximately 10-mile transmission line that will interconnect the substations and make it easier to get electricity to its customers. This project is huge, not only in scale, but also in projected cost, which is $850 million. And that's a lot of money, and ratepayers will be on the hook for this money for years to come.
Okay. And when is construction slated to begin, and also perhaps if you have a date when it may end?
Well, Pepco has indicated on its website that construction is slated to begin in 2020 and to end in 2026. But that's construction schedules change, so we'll see. But I think regardless of the beginning date and the end date, I think the period for construction will be approximately 8 years.
About 8 years. Okay. Okay. And you mentioned there's going to be a cost for Capital Grid. So consumers are always looking at the bottom line on the bill. About how much of a difference will this make on the actual bill?
Well, we estimate we, meaning OPC, estimate that consumers will be paying between $10 and $12 a month on their bills. And the cost recovery will not occur immediately. PEPCO will have to submit a request in a rate application to recover cost. OPC will be scrutinizing these requests to make sure that they are warranted, and it is not necessarily a given that PEPCO will recover every single cost that it requests.
Okay.
But we will keep our eyes on all that.
Okay. Is this going to be a cost that consumers can see actually like a line item on their bill, or is this just going to be included in rates?
It will be included in rates. I have not seen anything to indicate that there will be a separate line item on the bill saying Capital Grid project, expense.
Okay. Now, did OPC have any concerns about this Capital Grid project, and how did it voice those concerns to the DC Public Service Commission?
The OPC had several concerns, and in our office filed comments, and we first filed comments in 2017 when shortly after PEPCO submitted its first phase 1 application. Then we subsequently filed reply comments and another round of comments and reply comments. And one of our concerns was that, and remains, that the project costs too much and that reasonable alternatives to PEPCO's proposal exist. The Commission has since issued a couple of orders approving both phases 1 and 2 of the Capital Grid project and directing PEPCO to go ahead and proceed with its construction. But the Commission concluded that based on the alternative proposals it saw and studied, that they were not as feasible, or in some cases were more costly than PEPCO's proposal. And so the Commission approved PEPCO's proposal. Okay. Another concern we had is that PEPCO's load growth projections for the Mount Vernon area were inaccurate. And it's a concern we've had for a while about PEPCO's load forecast, but the Commission disagreed and approved PEPCO's methodology. Okay. And we were also concerned that PEPCO had submitted a proposal that depended on traditional utility standards for increasing capacity instead of aggressively integrating renewable energy projects onto the grid. So connecting renewable energy projects on the grid. So those are three main concerns we've had.
Okay. All right. And some of those renewable sources would that be solar primarily?
Well, they would be solar. They include like battery storage, energy efficiency, those sorts of things.
Okay. Yeah, one thing that OPC will be looking at is when we integrate those technologies, that they be done in an equitable manner. Thank you very much for that, Barbara.
Sure.
Okay, Thaddeus, let's turn now to Washington Gas's project Pipes. We'll just start out in general. What is Project Pipes?
Yes, first, I wanted to note that, of course, with utilities, it's usually something that we don't think about until something goes awry or it's not there.
Right.
And especially when utilities are underground, they have a tendency to be out of sight and out of mind.
Yeah.
Project Pipes is Washington Gas's 40-year plan to improve its aging infrastructure in Washington, D.C. Okay. It's a large project. It's going to take a long time. It's also important to note that the Commission did not approve Washington Gas's entire 40-year plan at once. In 2014, it gave WGL approval for the first 5 years of Project Pipes.
Okay.
And in 2018, WGL requested approval for the second 5-year phase. And as a consumer advocate, OPC is participating in these proceedings to make sure that the ratepayers receive the performance they're entitled to.
Okay. All right. And if you could, why is Project Pipes important to consumers? If they were just hearing what you said, why is it important to me as a consumer?
Well, thinking about energy delivery, the safety of the energy delivery, and what this means for long term. Of course, there are financial impacts, lifestyle impacts, and of course, it touches on the environment.
Okay. Speaking of the environment, the District of Columbia has some pretty aggressive climate goals over the next 20 to 30 years. What is the impact of Project Pipes on the district's climate goals?
Well, a natural gas infrastructure project and the system in general, it affects what we think about with the environment in at least two ways.
Okay.
First, when it comes to natural gas, we're using a lot more of it.
Yeah.
So natural gas has displaced coal for probably about the last 10 years as the main source of fuel for generating electricity.
Yeah.
So while at the end point it burns a lot more cleanly than coal,
Yeah.
it's still a fossil fuel,
Right.
and it contributes to carbon. Secondly, from the generation, transportation, and distribution of natural gas, it's not a system that is completely enclosed and is able to capture all of the gas. It produces, particularly from shale, it produces methane, ethane, butane, and other heavy hydrocarbons that displace gas. So along the way that this is transported, there are leaks. And so it's the leaks that Washington Gas Project is slated to address.
Yeah. Yeah, leaks are definitely an issue, not only for safety, but also for, as you said, the greenhouse gas emissions. What is OPC's position on Project Pipes?
Well, it's been slow progress on this very critical issue.
Okay.
So from our perspective, Washington Gas has actually lagged behind, lagged behind its goals. And our job is to ensure that the commission, that appropriate attention is paid to the cost and the prioritization of what the company replaces.
Yeah. So and the cost this is going to be pretty costly. I imagine. I know Barbara mentioned $850 million, and I can imagine Project Pipes has a pretty hefty price tag as well.
Right. You did mention affordability, which we generally think about for residential households as their ability to pay for electricity, gas, and these other associated costs to get it to you. Okay. And as you mentioned, a large infrastructure project comes with a significant price tag.
Yes.
The Project Pipes 1, that part of the project had a total investment of $110 million. Wow. And how that broke out for the average residential heating customer, it was a surcharge of $25 or about $2 a month. Wow. The Project Pipes Phase 2 proposal, it projects a total expenditure of about $305 million.
Wow.
So that surcharge is expected to be about $49 annually or $4.08 per month.
Okay.
Some people might be able to absorb a $4 hit to the bill, but some people whose budgets are close to the bone, any increase could be something of a serious concern.
Yeah, that's it's all a matter of perspective in terms of the of these increases, and they are cumulative. You have Capital Grid, now you have Project Pipes. For our listeners, I am Lawrence Daniels of the Office of People's Counsel, sitting in for People's Counsel Sandra Matavu-Fry on OPC Radio Connect. We're talking with three members of the staff of the Office of the People's Counsel about large infrastructure projects. So thus far, we've seen these first two projects. We're looking at nearly $1 billion that ratepayers are going to be paying for many years to come. There's a third project that is also somewhat costly, and that is DC Plug. Travis, if you could, please explain to us what is DC Plug?
Sure. Thank you, Lawrence. If I may, I'd first like to rewind back to the first question you had posed regarding what brought about DC Plug. In my response, I mentioned former Mayor Vincent Gray forming an undergrounding task force in response to calamitous weather events and look at the feasibility of possibly undergrounding Pepco's poorest performing feeders. What I forgot to mention was that the People's Council was one of the stakeholders, number of the district's electric stakeholders were on the undergrounding task force, including the People's Council. And the People's Council advocated zealously to both make sure that DC Plug was both affordable, as well as provided maximum customer benefits and reliability benefits to all of Pepco's ratepayers, particularly those east of the river. Now, as for your question about what is DC Plug, first and foremost, the plug in DC Plug stands for Power Line Undergrounding Initiative. And the initiative itself is actually a historic public-private partnership between the district and PEPCO, and it's designed to improve PEPCO's electric distribution system's reliability and resiliency in response to more major storm and extreme weather events. I mentioned earlier, as far as reliability and resiliency, the difference there too. What's important to remember is that while DC Plug will improve reliability and resiliency, reliability is going to naturally improve as a result of improvements in resiliency. However, again, because the idea behind DC Plug is to storm harden PEPCO's distribution system, the main goal of it is to improve resiliency. In other words, make it enable it to do a better job of withstanding more severe weather events. And so, pursuant to DC Plug, PEPCO as well as DDOT are going to underground approximately 30 of PEPCO's poorest performing overhead power lines, release parts either in their entirety or in part. And the undergrounding will take place in wards 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8 over the course of the next 6 years. PEPCO is going to be responsible for the electrical engineering. And by electrical engineering, what I'm referring to is they'll be undergrounding things such as electrical cable, fuses, switches, transformers, and ancillary facilities, whereas DDOT is going to be responsible for the civil engineering construction, such as undergrounding conduit, duct banks, electrical vaults, manholes, and transformer pads.
Okay, so it's a lot of coordination going on. A lot of entities across the city are involved in this one. Have there been any changes with respect to Plug? You mentioned this started back in about 2012. We're now 8 years in. What any changes you can talk about?
There have been several. So under the original undergrounding statute, which was passed back in 2014, there were several things that were in place that are no longer in place as a result of an amendment of that statute in 2017. Just to briefly cover some of those, for example, under the initial statute, PEPCO and DDOT were required to file what was known as a triennial plan. Triennial plan simply is a 3-year construction plan that not only laid out the construction projects for the next 3 years, but also the proposed costs as well as a surcharge to recover both PEPCO's costs and DDOT's costs. Also, the initial statute, which again has subsequently been revised, it actually sought to help DDOT recover its costs, construction costs, through a bond issue. That bond issue is no longer being used to fund DDOT's construction costs. Instead, what's being used is something known as a pay-as-you-go plan, which simply means the district assesses a certain amount of money to PEPCO. That money is used to pay DDOT's construction costs, and then PEPCO is able to recover those monies through an underground rider from its ratepayers. Also, DC Plug initially was envisioned as being a $1 billion 10-year project. However, again, as a result of the amendment of the undergrounding statute in 2017, it's now envisioned, not envisioned, it is a $500 million project. And again, this will take place over the next 6 years.
Oh, wow. Now, you mentioned some equipment names. You talked about feeders, transformers. Could you give us just a brief description, if consumers could visualize what these pieces of equipment mean, what they are and what they do?
Sure. So again, DC Plug is focusing exclusively on undergrounding PEPCO's poorest performing primary and lateral lines. So the primary lines, they are lines that carry power at a pretty high voltage, and they actually tend to run alongside major roadways. And you can find them located at the top of utility poles, typically in sets of 3. Those are your primary lines. The lateral lines, they are smaller lines. They don't serve as many customers, but they still serve a significant number. The voltage level is lower, and they tend to bring power from a feeder or a power line into the neighborhood. So those typically are the feeders you see in your neighborhood at the top of the utility pole. And again, it could be either 1 line, 2 lines, or sometimes even lateral lines. There may be 3 of them at the top of utility poles as well. And the idea is by focusing, I should mention it, primary and lateral lines serve the most customers on PEPCO's distribution system. So the idea behind DC Plug is that if you isolate the poorest performing feeders amongst that group and you underground those, well, then you're increasing the likelihood of making PEPCO's distribution system much more resilient in the wake of extreme weather events.
Okay. All right. So you talked briefly about the cost for this. Is this going to be something we're going to see a line item on the bill, or is this going to kind of be baked into the rates?
Actually, it's a hybrid, Lawrence.
Okay.
So PEPCO's construction costs are going to be recovered through what's called a surcharge, known as the underground project charge. So that charge is going to appear on customers' bills actually starting around the end of this month, and is currently going to result in about a 3 cent in monthly bill impact to customer bills. Now, DDOT's construction costs are going to be recovered through a rate rider. Rate riders, they do not appear on the customer bill. They're actually kind of an addition to the rate schedule this each customer served under. And the current rate impact, monthly bill impact, I should say, for the underground rider is about 87 cents.
Okay.
And I should mention that both the underground project charge and underground rider they'll be paid by all of PEPCO's residential customers except the RAD customers, those receiving their residential aid discount.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to another issue. Just thinking of all these costs for these three projects. I'm not just talking about the basic rates we pay, but just adding all three of these together. It's a pretty big energy burden, I would think, cost burden on consumers. And I think affordability, I know Barbara's mentioned it and Thad has as well. Affordability is an issue. And I know, for our listeners' sake, OPC is in the process of conducting a very comprehensive affordability study to look at the actual impact of projects like the three that we're talking about today and other rates that are on the bill to ensure that we have programs in place to help those, especially those who are the most vulnerable. I know in DC Plug, you just mentioned that RAD customers who are already receiving assistance don't have to pay those particular charges. But we're also looking at ways to make sure that other people who are perhaps above the RAD qualifications, who are feeling the pinch as well, can have some relief from a number of these projects. So we're about ready to close out this edition of OPC Radio Connect. I want to thank Barbara Burton, Thaddeus Johnson, and Travis Smith. I'm sure in future podcasts we are going to talk about a couple of other issues that were touched on today. One of which would probably be the as I said, DC Public Service Commission determines only 35% of your bill. The other 65 is determined by the federal government. So I'm sure we're going to have a podcast addressing that as well, because it's going to be, a big part of your bill. I just want to touch briefly, Thaddeus, if you could, on quality of life. How will all these projects kind of affect the quality of life in the District of Columbia?
That's a good question, because when you start doing these type of projects, it does have an impact on people, businesses, pedestrian traffic. So imagine if a person came home and there was the street was dug up, there was a metal plate, there were cones and barriers, and you couldn't get into your driveway. Yeah. This type of thing has happened. So these type of projects can impact people getting to and from home, as well as small businesses that rely on foot traffic.
Yes.
When these things happen, they're not quick projects, and so there has to be a plan in place to accommodate that. So as a stakeholder in this process, OPC is not always an antagonistic relationship. We work with the companies to craft the communications to help smooth this process out.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's also a coordinated effort to, with all this construction, all this digging, and there is some coordination going on between all the agencies. Everybody's aware that we're doing this. Okay, again, I want to say that we're ready to close out this edition of OPC Radio Connect. It's been very informative. I'd like to thank the three attorneys, Barbara Burton, Thaddeus Johnson, and Travis Smith. We hope you will join us for future podcasts when we cover a variety of topics relating to utility service, energy, climate change, among other issues, and most importantly, make you aware that OPC can help when you have a problem with your utilities. We welcome your feedback. OPC, we represent utility consumers, and we need your feedback. You can email us at info@opc-dc.gov, or you can contact us through Facebook at DC People's Council. On Twitter, it's at DCOPC, or you can just give us a call, 202-727-3071. Again, that number at OPC is 202-727-3071. And our website is www.opc-dc.gov. Until next time, I am Lawrence Daniels, and I thank you for joining us.
You've been listening to an encore episode of this program. The views and opinions on this program were solely those of the host and their guests and do not express the views or opinions of the D.C. Office of Cable Television, Film, Music, and Entertainment. For more information about our programs, visit dcradio.gov.